What has been your experience in the role of making a rescue? Kind of off camera, we had talked about, soft rescues and hard rescues, if you can explain the difference between the two. What's been your experience in being involved in that? And what's the impact on the victims when you, as a Westerner, an American, I would assume a white Christian male, how does that play into how the victim sees you when you make that first contact?
Yeah, that's a great question. So traditionally what people see on the news and what most documentaries is, and that's really what led us to create our own nonprofit is the hard rescues are, you see, the sensationalization of, a group of 8 people in a room that were special operators, and they've got their op plan up on the wall, and they're in full kit, and they're going to go do these hard rescues. The reality of that is that that's how people end up in prison overseas doing those kind of things, and it's happened many times. And the result is that obviously that organization can't go back in that country. They maybe solved something initially. It was a small win in some cases, but because of the horrible prosecution rate overseas of human sex trafficking cases, for a variety of reasons, usually the women are released and back in the same environment again. So they've done more harm than good, in my opinion, and that's only my opinion. But so we kind of coined the term soft rescues. And so soft rescues is, how do you work with the people of that country, the government of that country, the NGOs of that country, to solve the problem or mitigate the problem as best you can without creating harm to the victims of sex trafficking, and how to make the community more aware and help the community. So trying to break down the cultural barriers that may be in existence in that country, because in country A, it may be that, the sale of child brides, or in my opinion, has been accepted for years. How do you kind of change that, how harmful that is to these young women? And so soft rescues are the example I gave you. COVID was a windfall, because we could provide something else, create rapport, and say, now that we have rapport with you, can we take your children away from, the brothel environment and then move them to a better place in life? And so our creation of these different safe havens, that was what we call them, is we have Safe Haven A, for example. That's where we put the children. And then as the children become whole, they're also allowed several times a month to visit the mother. And that was created from rapport within the brothel.
I understand.
And then Safe Haven B is, at one point in time, in the conversations we have with the mothers during these monthly visits, we ask the questions, at one point in time, could you get out of bondage? Well, the mother may say, for this amount of money, I could be out of bondage. Or I have 2 more years and I'm out of bondage. And if they get close enough for the right amount of money, then we can say, well, we'll pay for the release of your bondage. And then they go to Safe Haven B. Obviously, it takes a long time for them to recover, to become reunited fully with their children, but they can see them. Safe Haven A and B can see them. We can still educate the children. We can still provide shelter for them and food, subsistence. And now we're helping the mother.
I think that I'm having this understanding, this correlative understanding of what you're doing, and something that I continually find, like, where I'm butting heads with different security guards. Mm-hmm. And you talked about the visual of the hard rescue, which is the guys all kitted up, and the tactical aspect. And that is the first image that I had. I talked to our cameraman about it, and I was like, oh, this must be what it's like. And I think that that's the perception of how you get things done. Whether we're talking about recovering victims from sex trafficking, or we're talking about, dealing with the homeless issue that we have outside of our street right now. From a tactical standpoint, it's cool to think of the hard rescue, having the kit, being the big strong guy, having 8 of you kick the door in, and pull this person out on your shoulder. But you're right, in these other countries where their view of women is vastly different than ours here in the West, their view of children, their view of sex, their view of marriage, their view of religion, all of these things are so intertwined. And you said it so perfectly, like, what you do in these countries, they will throw you in prison, and there's no way to get around that. You're talking about a long-term process of basically a psyop and setting up a situation where you're able to create this rapport with the initial victim in order to ultimately get that person out down the road. But you're doing that by creating that relationship with them, getting their children to a safer situation, and then by having their children in a safer situation, ultimately being able to get that original victim out. I mean, this is something that clearly must take a long amount of time. In the situation that you've described, what's the timeline of that? Like, how long does something like that take?
It could take 3 to 4 years to move that whole process. As an example, you bring the children into the safe haven A. They can be there for a year or so just to make them whole as much as possible from the trauma they've seen. Most of these young women have laid under the bed of their mother. Their mothers do their work in very small rooms in most countries that I've been to. The children, 2 to 3 of the children are laying under the bed. The mother is servicing the clients. The children are under the bed. You can imagine the trauma they have from that experience because they think that's normal because since they were a child, and to let them know it's not normal, and to how to I have a saying that everybody's normal till you get to know them. Yeah. So it's trying to bring them back to some sense of normalcy and a stabilized life is what's challenging. So that could take a year. And then the mother's coming out, they have huge medical problems that have to be addressed. They have huge psychological problems that have to be addressed. Their mental health is paramount to us in that change. And then the third thing is for Safe Haven C, which is the third phase of it. How do you reunite them together, the mothers and the children, and how do you make the mothers and have the ability for their own subsistence to survive on their own and feel whole again and feel confident that they can stand on their own 2 legs, not have to rely upon these other problems. That's coupled with the difference between the United States and overseas as far as sex trafficking goes. Is that overseas, the challenge with sex trafficking is, one is prosecution, not being able to not a high prosecution rate of the traffickers and locking them up, get them out of the business. The second thing is the resources, and the resources is, it looks great to be in kit and have these big op plans and go do all this stuff. It's adventurous to people, but the question is, and that's a problem I had and why we started our own nonprofit, was what do you do with them afterwards? If you look at sex trafficking organizations that work anywhere, how much does it cost to house a young woman that's been rescued? And a lot of people want to rescue the women, but they don't have a plan about how they're going to take care of them.
Absolutely.
And so we run into problems with the laws in the U.S., and that is that to rescue a woman in the U.S., once you take her into your custody, you have to provide everything for her, and there's all kinds of things you got to provide. You try to take her to a mental health care, it could be $120 an hour, it could be $300 an hour. You try to take her to the hospital, well, you're responsible for her now. You got a bill for $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. You got to house her. How expensive is to house a woman in the U.S.? I run safe havens overseas for a little less than $100,000 a year for 20 women in each safe haven. That's pretty effective. We have over 20 full-time staff overseas now that provide the services that we do, and it's a lot less expensive because they're locals that want to do a good job, and it doesn't cost us as much money, and we're able to do a lot more overseas. In the U.S., the problem is resources. You look at some of the biggest police departments in the United States and start going and ask them how many people they have working in human sex trafficking cases. Maybe they got 2 detectives, maybe they got 3, maybe they got 4, maybe they got 1, maybe they got 1 half-time detective. And then you go to the DA's office and the local larger cities and go, how many DAs do you have that are focused on sex trafficking cases? Maybe one. You know, maybe if they're really lucky and it's a big city, 2 or 3. But the cases just come in and come in and come in. And so an organization like that in the U.S. has to raise $1 million to take care of 10 women.
Right.
I can rescue hundreds and hundreds of women overseas for $1 million.